Anna, a black woman 8 months pregnant, was driving alone to the hospital as a growing pain radiated in her lower back, an alarming sign of the complications she had been suffering from for several weeks. Her hands gripping the steering wheel betrayed her anxiety, while her breath grew shorter. She tried to stay focused, but her mind was overwhelmed with worry for her baby's health. Each contraction, more intense than the last, reminded her of the fragility of the situation. The road ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, every red light or slowdown amplifying her nervousness. She had always been strong, facing life's challenges with determination, but in this moment, a wave of fear overwhelmed her. Her husband had reassured her that morning, reminding her to stay confident, but those words now seemed distant in the face of the urgency she was facing. Anxiety flooded her with each passing mile, her mind oscillating between hope and the fear that time was no longer on her side. She imagined her baby, wondering if everything would be all right, praying to get there on time. The soft music playing on the radio seemed out of place amidst the intensity of her thoughts. The road was familiar, yet in this moment, it felt foreign, almost hostile. She felt the gaze of other drivers, indifferent to her situation, as her world tilted into uncertainty. Suddenly, the blaring sirens of a police car shattered the silence in Anna's car, filling the air with a sudden and unexpected tension. Her heart tightened as she glanced in her rear-view mirror. Behind her, a patrol car with flashing lights was tailing her closely. Anna felt her breath catch in her chest. Why were they following her? She wasn't speeding, she was obeying the speed limits, and she hadn't broken any traffic rules. Nothing about her driving should have drawn the attention of the police. Yet, they were there, and it could only mean one thing. She had to pull over. Her first reaction was confusion. Why now, when she was already battling the growing pain in her back and the anxiety for her baby's health? The thought of interacting with the police at this moment felt unbearable. But soon, confusion gave way to a surge of intense anxiety. As a black woman, she knew all too well that any interaction with law enforcement could take an unpredictable, even dangerous turn, even if she had done nothing wrong. She had heard stories, chilling accounts of routine traffic stops that turned into tragedies simply because of a glance, a misunderstanding, or worse, a matter of prejudice. She quickly glanced at her round belly, where her baby was still moving gently. She wasn't alone. She wasn't just protecting herself, but also the life she carried. The tension in her shoulders increased as she searched for a place to pull over, fighting to stay calm. Her hands, which moments ago had been clenched on the wheel due to the pain, now trembled slightly from fear. The sirens kept blaring behind her, almost suffocating her. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to stay cautious. She knew that one mistake, one wrong move could change the course of the situation. Taking a deep breath, she repeated silently to herself, "Stay calm, do exactly as they say. Don't make any sudden moves." But another, even more oppressive thought came to her mind. What if something went wrong? What if this stop turned into one of those terrifying stories she had seen on the news? Taking a deep breath, Anna forced herself to comply despite the fear that was paralyzing her. She slowly maneuvered her car to the shoulder, her hands still trembling on the wheel. The sirens finally stopped, but their echoes still rang in her head, amplifying her discomfort. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, as a uniformed officer approached her window. His face was stern, closed off, devoid of any emotion. On his chest, embroidered in capital letters, was his name, Smith. Anna desperately searched for any sign of humanity in his gaze, but found none. In a dry voice, with no effort to mask his authoritative tone, Officer Smith asked for her papers. Anna, her hands trembling, fumbled through her bag. The stress, combined with the pain in her back, made every movement painful. She finally handed over her papers, her voice breaking with anxiety as she tried to explain the situation. "I'm 8 months pregnant. I need to get to the hospital urgently. I'm having complications," she stammered, hoping he would understand the urgency and let her go quickly. But there was no sign of understanding in Smith's eyes. He remained impassive, as if he hadn't heard a word she said. Without a word of empathy, he ordered her to get out of the car. Anna felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Her mind began to race, unable to comprehend why he was acting so insensitively. Why didn't he see that she was in distress? That every second spent here was a second too long for her baby? She tried to stay calm, not letting panic take over. But anxiety kept rising relentlessly as she struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt. Getting out of the car felt like torture, each movement worsening the stabbing pain in her back. She managed to extricate herself with difficulty, instinctively placing one hand on her swollen belly. They can't be this insensitive, she thought to herself silently as the anxiety twisted her stomach. I need to get to the hospital, please, she murmured in a pleading voice, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. But Smith remained unshaken. His face was as cold as the night falling around them. To him, Anna was just another driver to stop, an obstacle in his way. Seconds stretched on, each moment of the officer's indifference deepening the chasm of misunderstanding between them. Anna straightened as best as she could, the weight of her belly making every movement more painful. The physical pressure mingled with the fear that gripped her. The distress of not being believed, of not being seen for what she was, a woman in distress, a future mother in danger, turned into despair. At that precise moment, all she wanted was to be allowed to continue her journey, to be given the chance to protect the life she carried. But everything in Officer Smith's gaze told Anna that compassion was not on the agenda that night. Smith completely ignored her pleas, his face remaining closed and indifferent. His brusque movements, with no consideration for her condition, forced her to move despite the visible pain on her face. Anna, bewildered, felt panic mixing with confusion. Why was he acting so cruelly? Why refused he to understand that every minute mattered for her and her baby? She tried once again to speak to him, but her words seemed to hit a wall of indifference. Then, without warning, Officer Smith grabbed her arm and violently shoved her against her car. The shock was brutal, inhuman. Anna, stunned by the force of the action, lost her balance and fell to the ground with a heartbreaking cry. The world around her seemed to stop. The impact of the fall, amplified by the hardness of the asphalt, stole her breath, but it was nothing compared to the searing pain that shot through her belly. She instinctively placed her hands on her rounded abdomen, terror overtaking the pain. Something was wrong. She knew this pain wasn't normal. It was a deep, throbbing pain, one that told her that her baby, the one she had waited for so long, was in danger. The world around her became blurry, her thoughts muddled as she fought to keep from spiraling into total panic. Each breath became more difficult, each second more laden with meaning. Her scream, torn and full of despair, echoed in the silent night. "Help me," she screamed, her voice full of distress. But Smith, relentless, stood frozen in his coldness. He made no move to help her. He barely looked at her, as if her suffering didn't matter, as if she were just an obstacle in his path. The terror grew inside Anna, mixing with the unbearable pain. She felt tears rising, uncontrollable, as she fought to stay conscious, to stay strong, despite the agony consuming her. She tried to move, to rise, but her body no longer responded, weighed down by pain and fear. "My baby," she whispered faintly, her thoughts consumed by only one thing, saving the life she carried. But Smith showed no compassion. He stood over her, impassive, as if he didn't see the gravity of the situation, as if he didn't hear her cry for help. The world around Anna seemed to sink into a slow agony. Cars passed by in the distance, indifferent to her distress, while time stretched around her. Each second without assistance brought her closer to an unimaginable fear, the fear of losing her baby, right there on the side of the road, abandoned by the cruel indifference of a man who refused to see her humanity. A few minutes later, an ambulance was finally called, but it wasn't Officer Smith who took this initiative. No, he stood there, stoic, almost detached from the reality of the tragic scene unfolding before him. It was a passerby, a man who had witnessed the horror from the other side of the street, who, unable to bear the sight of this injustice any longer, had grabbed his phone with trembling hands and dialed for help. He watched, his heart pounding, as a pregnant woman lay on the ground, unable to get up, while the officer remained motionless, as if none of this mattered. When the ambulance finally arrived, the sirens cut through the night with a sharp sound, but this time, it was a sound filled with hope. The paramedics, seeing Anna's condition, rushed to her. They found her lying on the asphalt, barely breathing, her face marked by pain and fear. Her belly, tight from early contractions, clearly showed that the situation was critical. Every second now mattered, not only for Anna's life but for her baby's as well. Anna's gaze met that of the passerby, who stood at a distance, his eyes filled with terror and empathy. That simple gesture, that call for her baby, was like a beacon in her ocean of despair. She wanted to say thank you, but the words got stuck in her throat, her voice too weak, her body too exhausted. The paramedics, with breathtaking professionalism, gently lifted her and placed her on a stretcher. "Don't worry, ma'am. We're taking you to the hospital right away," one of them said, trying to mask the urgency of the situation with a reassuring tone. But Anna knew, she felt it in every fiber of her being. She and her baby were between life and death. The pain radiating from her abdomen seemed to have taken over her entire body. She felt her mind wavering, sinking into an abyss of pain and exhaustion. With every contraction, with every movement of the stretcher, she fought to stay conscious, to not succumb to the darkness that threatened to overtake her. Her heart was still beating, but she knew time was running out. Once inside the ambulance, the doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped toward the hospital at full speed, sirens wailing, tearing through the quiet night. Inside, one of the paramedics took her hand, gently pressing it, speaking to keep her awake. "Stay with us, ma'am. You're going to make it," he said, his grave tone showing that he understood the urgency of the situation better than anyone. But the words, even spoken gently, could not erase the fear that was written all over Anna's face. Her husband's face came to her mind. That morning, he had told her to stay confident, but now every moment seemed to push her closer to the void. Fatigue and pain overwhelmed her, and all she could think of was one thing: her baby had to survive. With every passing second, her breath became shorter, more difficult. The ambulance sped through traffic, weaving between cars, while the regular beeping of the machines monitoring her vital signs filled the cramped space. Every turn was a new wave of pain. She felt her body slipping away, as if floating somewhere between the world of the living and that of shadows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the hospital. The ambulance doors opened suddenly, and she was immediately taken care of by a medical team. They spoke rapidly among themselves, using technical terms she didn't understand, but she could see the urgency in their actions. She didn't know if she would make it, but only one thing mattered now: the life of her baby. As she slipped into unconsciousness, a tear slid down her cheek. What none of the officers knew was that Anna was married to one of the most influential figures in the country, Senator Gabriel Torres. He, a man respected for his relentless fight against police violence and racial discrimination, arrived at the hospital just a few minutes after receiving an alarming call. The voice on the other end, trembling and full of despair, had mentioned a critical situation involving his wife. With a heavy heart, he rushed through the hospital corridors, his mind chaotic with thoughts. Gabriel was a man of principles, known for his commitment to exposing abuses of power. His political career had been built on the promise of defending the oppressed, amplifying the voices of the voiceless. But this time, it was personal. Anna, the mother of his unborn child, was the victim of the very system he fought against every day. His mind was filled with horrifying scenarios. What had happened? Why hadn't he been there to protect her? As he entered the emergency room, the cold light and antiseptic smell hit him in the face. His heart was racing. Doctors were bustling around a stretcher, their faces grim. Gabriel stepped forward determinedly, but a nurse stopped him, asking him to wait. "You can't enter right now, Senator. Your wife is being stabilized." "We need a few more minutes," she said, her gaze serious. He nodded, but his mind was already in turmoil. He knew every second counted. Anna, vulnerable and injured, needed him, but there was nothing he could do. At that moment, he remembered their last moments together, their shared happiness, and his promise to always protect her. A deep anger began to grow inside him, anger not only toward the officer who had been so brutal but also at a system that allowed such injustices to happen. As the minutes stretched on, he became more impatient. Memories of his career struggles, of his passionate speeches about justice and equality, resurfaced in his mind. He recalled the thousands of people to whom he had promised to amplify their voices. Now, Anna's voice echoed in him, whispering that he couldn't give up. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his face marked with concern. Gabriel approached, his heart pounding. "How is she? Is the baby okay?" The doctor, in a calm but firm voice, replied, "We're doing everything we can. She has suffered severe injuries, and her condition is critical. We need your moral support for her and the baby." At those words, Gabriel felt his stomach twist. The doctor continued, explaining the need for an imminent surgery. "We must act quickly. Your support will be crucial for her when she wakes up. She will need you." Gabriel nodded, determined. He knew he had to be strong, not only for himself but especially for Anna and their child. He sat down in the waiting room, his mind swirling. He began to think of everything he had to do to bring justice, to ensure that this act of injustice would not only be forgotten, but would serve as a catalyst for lasting change. As he waited, he took out his phone and began writing a message to his advisors. He wanted to mobilize his allies, alert the media, and make sure Anna's story was not silenced. Every minute counted, and he knew he had to act quickly to protect his family and end this cycle of systemic violence. The pain he felt for his wife was immense, but he also felt an increasing sense of determination. He promised himself that this tragic event would trigger a larger fight against police brutality, that his wife's cry would resonate beyond the hospital walls and into the hearts of millions. When Smith learned who Anna was, his face instantly paled. The words rang in his mind like a distress bell. Senator Gabriel Torres, the champion of civil rights, a man whose voice was powerful and respected. He realized, too late, the gravity of his mistake. The woman he had brutally harmed was not just an ordinary citizen. She was the wife of the man who could not only destroy his career but also expose the systemic racism he was a part of. The weight of this realization overwhelmed him. Smith recalled every action he had taken, every order he had given, realizing that he had underestimated not only Anna but also the magnitude of the consequences of his actions. The fear of a violent reaction from Gabriel seized him, but it wasn't just the fear of losing his job that terrified him. It was the fear of seeing his name associated with a major scandal, of being identified as the officer whose brutality sparked the outrage of an entire country. As the anxiety rose within him, he began imagining the possible repercussions. Gabriel wouldn't stay silent. He was a man of action, a defender of the victims of injustice. Smith knew he risked becoming the symbol of a police force that thought it was above the law, a glaring example of the systemic abuses he had always denied. The media would seize the story, turning it into a storm of outrage, and the pressure would mount for action to be taken against him and his department. In that moment, he felt a wave of regret take over him, but he knew the damage was done. The image of Anna, lying on the ground, her pain palpable and her cry for help, haunted his thoughts. For the first time, he began to understand the depth of the suffering he had contributed to perpetuating. Systemic racism was not an abstract concept. It was a devastating reality that destroyed lives, including that of this innocent woman. As he stood there, paralyzed by fear and shame, he noticed fellow officers approaching, their faces marked with concern. They had heard rumors, whispers about what had happened. They were already trying to assess the situation, seeking to understand how things had escalated this far. Smith knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let others discover the truth about what he had done. Guilt began to gnaw at him, but at the same time, He felt a surge of instinct rising in him, a survival instinct. He had to find a way to turn the situation to his advantage, to minimize the damage. Maybe he could pass this off as a simple incident, a regrettable misunderstanding. He began thinking of excuses, justifications, trying to find an escape from his actions. But as this thought crossed his mind, he couldn't ignore the voice of his conscience, screaming at him to face his actions. Suddenly, he understood that no matter what angle he tried to take, the truth would eventually come to light. Ana would not be silenced. Gabriel Torres would not let this case fall into oblivion. In the meantime, he had to remain calm. The other officers were already discussing the next steps. Smith joined them, feigning innocence while trying to understand how this situation would unfold. But deep down, a storm was brewing, and he knew the consequences of his arrogance were just beginning to take shape. Gabriel, with a cold rage, swore not to let this act go unpunished. The events of the previous day swirled in his mind, fueling a controlled fury that was slowly transforming into unwavering determination. He was Senator Gabriel Torres, a man of principle and commitment, and he could not allow the assault on his wife, Ana, to be buried under the weight of silence. Every detail of that tragic night returned to his memory, fueling his anger and outrage. He began to think about everything this meant. Not only did he have to fight for Ana, but also for all the women who, like her, had been victims of abuse of power. This wasn't just a matter of personal justice, it was a matter of social justice. Ana represented thousands of silenced voices, and he had the platform and means to give them a chance to be heard. Gabriel knew he had to act quickly. As soon as he returned home, he would begin drafting a public statement. It would be the first step in a larger campaign to denounce police violence and call for necessary reforms. He wanted to ensure that Anna's name would not be forgotten, that she would not just be another victim among many. He would make her story a symbol, a rallying cry for change. He wanted Smith to be severely punished. The injustice committed against Ana could not go unanswered. Gabriel began drafting a formal complaint against Smith, acting not only as a desperate husband, but also as a senator of the Republic. His position granted him considerable influence, and he was determined to use it to ensure that his wife's assault would not be swept under the rug. Smith's arrest was immediate. Gabriel knew it would be a tough battle, but he had no intention of backing down. Every day, Gabriel went to the hospital to be by Anna's side, supporting her recovery while continuing his fight. The hours spent with her, holding her hand, talking about their memories, and imagining a future together, gave him immeasurable strength. He saw in her eyes the will to fight, and that encouraged him to keep going, to not give up. He knew that the outcome of this case was not only dependent on Ana, but also on the future of all those who had suffered in silence. Every meeting with the doctors, every step forward in Anna's recovery, was a source of hope for him, reminding him why he was fighting. Gabriel immersed himself in the case, examining every aspect of the assault and seeking testimony from other victims of police abuse. He wanted to prove that this was not an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of a system deeply rooted in racism and impunity. At the hospital, as he spoke to Ana, he explained the steps he was taking, the complaint he had filed, and how he planned to mobilize public opinion. "We're going to change things, Ana. I promise you," he would say, determined to fight for her and for all those who had been victims of violence. He knew he could not do it alone. He needed support, from the community and especially from Ana by his side. The day Smith was arrested, Gabriel felt a mix of emotions. He was angry at the man who had hurt his wife, but he was also aware that the arrest was only the beginning of a long struggle. The media was present, covering the event live, and cameras captured every moment. Gabriel knew this could have a significant impact, not only for Ana, but for all those who had suffered similar abuse. News of Smith's arrest spread like wildfire. Protests erupted across the country, with people chanting slogans demanding justice for Ana and all victims of police violence. Gabriel, bolstered by this public support, continued working with his fellow senators to draft legislative proposals aimed at reforming police practices. He knew it would take time and effort, but every step he took, every message of support he received, strengthened his determination. The community was mobilizing, and he was increasingly convinced that this moment could be the catalyst for significant change. Together, they could put an end to the culture of impunity that had allowed officers like Smith to act without fear of consequences. Gabriel knew he could not give up. The love he felt for Anna, his desire to see her heal and thrive, was stronger than ever. He continued his fight, determined to make his voice heard, the voice of his wife, and the voices of all those who had suffered in silence. Every day, every step forward in Anna's recovery was a victory in itself, a step toward a future where acts like Smith's would no longer be tolerated.